In 1692, a bitter wind swept through a small Puritan village on the edge of the New World. It carried whispers, rumors, and the scent of something unseen. People began to look at one another differently, to question the familiar faces they had known all their lives. A cough in the night, a strange dream, a glance held too long could mean the devil was near. Within months, the village of Salem became a place of terror. Children convulsed and screamed of spirits. Ministers preached of Satan's army walking among them. Neighbors accused neighbors. Friends turned to informants. The word witch, once only a warning in Scripture, now meant death. But beneath the surface of that hysteria was something far more human. It was not the devil's hand that tore Salem apart, but fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of judgment, fear of losing control. It was greed disguised as righteousness, suspicion cloaked in faith. And in that darkness, the fragile bonds of community shattered. This is not the story of witches or magic. It is the story of power, paranoia, and how belief itself can become a weapon. It is the dark truth behind the Salem Witch Trials. In the late 17th century, on the rugged edge of the Massachusetts wilderness, a small Puritan settlement stood as a symbol of faith and fragility. The people of Salem believed they were chosen by God to build a city upon a hill, a shining example of moral purity in a world they saw as corrupt and sinful. They had crossed an ocean to escape religious persecution, only to build a community that would soon be consumed by the very thing they feared most. Life in Salem was hard and unforgiving. The winters were brutal, the soil rocky, and every harvest felt like a test of divine favor. The settlers lived in constant awareness of sin and the possibility of damnation. Every misfortune, from a failed crop to a sudden illness, was seen as a message from God. To survive, they clung tightly to faith, to structure, and to the belief that good and evil were in constant battle around them. In such a world, there was little room for doubt. The Puritans believed that Satan was real, active, and cunning. He did not attack openly but worked through human vessels. Anyone could be tempted. Anyone could fall. It was this conviction that would soon transform ordinary suspicion into deadly certainty. The Salem Witch Trials were not born out of chaos alone. They grew from the soil of fear and faith, from the human need to explain the unexplainable. A handful of strange events, a few unexplained fits, and a community already stretched thin by hardship became the perfect storm for one of the darkest episodes in early American history. Over the course of just 1 year, more than 200 people would be accused of witchcraft. 20 would die. The rest would carry the scars for generations. Yet even as the gallows were built and the prayers were said, few understood what was truly happening beneath the surface. This was not a story about witches or spells. It was a story about people. About fear turned into policy. About power disguised as piety. And about how fragile the boundary is between faith and fanaticism. More than 3 centuries later, the story of Salem still feels uncomfortably familiar. It reminds us that fear, once given authority, can turn a community against itself. That truth can vanish when it no longer feels safe to question. And that even in the most devout of societies, darkness can take root in the name of righteousness. The Salem Witch Trials endure not just as a historical tragedy but as a timeless warning. A mirror held up to every generation that believes it could never happen again. Because when logic dies and panic takes its place, history shows us that it always can. Before the witch hunts began, Salem was already a community built on tension. It was not a single town but 2 settlements, Salem Village and Salem Town, divided by land, wealth, and purpose. Salem Town was a thriving port, filled with merchants and trade, a place where new ideas quietly slipped in from across the Atlantic. Salem Village, by contrast, was the agricultural heart, poor, isolated, and deeply religious. The villagers looked toward the coast and saw corruption. They believed their neighbors in town had grown soft, distracted by greed and luxury. This divide was more than economic. It was spiritual. The Puritans who settled New England had come seeking freedom, but they built their freedom on the belief that God demanded total obedience. Every sermon, every law, every social rule was designed to keep evil at bay. But that same devotion bred suspicion. If misfortune struck, if a crop failed, or if a child fell ill, it could not be random chance. It had to mean something. It had to be a sign that sin had entered their midst. For years before the first accusation, Salem village simmered with quiet resentment. Families quarreled over inheritance lines that stretched across generations. Ministers were appointed and dismissed in rapid succession as different factions fought for control of the pulpit. The powerful Putnam family clashed with the more prosperous Porters, a feud that split the village down the center. Church attendance became a test of loyalty rather than faith, and each sermon carried an undertone of threat. The winters only deepened the gloom. Snow sealed the small wooden homes for months, and isolation weighed heavily on the mind. The war with native tribes on the frontier had left behind stories of massacres and demonic savagery, reinforcing the Puritans' belief that the wilderness beyond their fields was the devil's domain. People began to see evil in every shadow, to imagine whispers in the forest and eyes in the dark. In truth, the people of Salem were not evil. They were frightened. They lived in a world where nature was harsh, death was close, and faith was the only thing standing between them and despair. But fear is a fire that seeks fuel, and Salem was full of it. Every grudge, every doubt, every silent envy was dry kindling waiting for a spark. The stage was set long before the first cry of witchcraft. It was not witches who cursed Salem, but the human need to make sense of chaos. In a community where faith ruled every thought, the idea that the devil walked among them was not superstition. It was an explanation, a comfort in the face of uncertainty. And so, when the first strange symptoms appeared in the winter of 1692, when young girls began to convulse and scream of unseen spirits, the people of Salem did not question the cause. They already knew the answer. They had been waiting for it. It began quietly, in the dead of winter, inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to act in ways that no one could explain. Their bodies twisted and jerked in violent convulsions. They screamed in voices that were not their own, spoke of invisible forces clawing at them, and claimed to see dark figures lurking in the corners of the room. At first, the villagers thought it was an illness. Reverend Parris prayed over the girls while doctors searched for a physical cause, but none could be found. In the world of the Puritans, where every mystery had a divine or demonic origin, there was only one other explanation. The devil had entered Salem. Word spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors crowded around the parsonage, whispering prayers and theories. Fear settled into every home like smoke. The minister called in other clergy for advice, and the conclusion was unanimous. The children were under an evil hand. The unseen enemy they had preached about for years was finally here. In this climate of terror, the girls began to speak names. Whether out of fear, suggestion, or manipulation, no one can say. But the first name they uttered would change everything. Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, owned by Reverend Parris himself. Her presence in the Puritan household was already a source of quiet unease. Her dark skin, her foreign accent, and her knowledge of folk rituals made her an easy target. When the children cried out that Tituba's spirit tormented them, the accusation fit the fears of the community too perfectly to be questioned. She was seized and interrogated for hours. At first she denied the charge, but as the questioning grew harsher, something in her broke. Perhaps she hoped confession would save her. Perhaps she simply told them what they wanted to hear. Whatever her reasons, her words set the entire village on fire. She told them of the devil's book, of signatures written in blood. She spoke of black dogs, strange birds, and shadowy figures that whispered commands in the night. She claimed there were other witches in Salem, working together to destroy the godly. To the Puritans, this was proof. Tituba's confession confirmed every nightmare the villagers had ever believed. If the devil could enter one soul, he could enter many. If one neighbor could be a witch, then anyone could. The fear that had simmered beneath the surface for years now erupted into panic. The line between the innocent and the guilty disappeared overnight. Children became witnesses. Ministers became investigators. And a whisper was enough to end a life. The spark had been struck, and the fire was spreading. Salem would never be the same again. When the first accusations were made, Salem's leaders believed they were facing an emergency of faith. To them, witchcraft was not superstition but treason against God. And so, in the spring of 1692, they built a new kind of courtroom, one meant not to question but to purge. A special tribunal was formed, called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and to determine. It was presided over by men who saw themselves as soldiers in a holy war. Judges like John Hathorne and William Stoughton believed that by rooting out witches, they were defending the very soul of New England. To doubt the existence of witchcraft, or to hesitate in condemning it, was to risk inviting evil into their midst. Inside the courtroom, the rules of reason began to unravel. The most dangerous kind of evidence soon became the most accepted, spectral evidence. This meant that if someone claimed to see your spirit or specter tormenting them in a dream or a vision, it could be used as proof against you. There were no witnesses, no physical marks, no visible acts of crime, yet it was enough to condemn. The trials became public performances of fear. Young girls collapsed and screamed during testimonies, writhing on the floor, pointing to invisible shapes that no one else could see. Their cries echoed through the wooden hall, and each scream confirmed what the audience already believed. Evil was among them. The crowd gasped, prayed, and whispered. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion, wondering who might be next. Soon, the accusations multiplied. What began as a few names quickly became dozens. Every conflict, every old grudge, every buried resentment rose to the surface. A cow that died unexpectedly, a crop that failed, a child that fell ill, each misfortune became evidence of witchcraft. Those with power or influence found themselves accused by those with none. The trials gave the poor and powerless a voice, but it was a voice born of fear, not justice. Women who lived alone, widows who owned land, and anyone who spoke too boldly were easy targets. Their independence was threatening in a society where obedience was a virtue. Even those who had devoted their lives to faith were not safe. Rebecca Nurse, a respected and elderly church member, was accused despite her long reputation for kindness. When she protested her innocence, the court saw her calmness as proof that she was in league with the devil. Each trial ended the same way, with confessions or death. Those who confessed were often spared, while those who maintained their innocence were hanged. This cruel logic forced many to lie to save their lives, while the honest were punished for their truth. The ministers preached that they were cleansing the village, but what they were truly doing was feeding a machine that thrived on fear. Every new confession created more names, more accusations, more trials. The system began to devour itself, fueled by its own hysteria. Salem's legal process had transformed into something unrecognizable. Justice no longer meant truth. It meant survival. The court that was meant to defend the godly had become an engine of destruction, running on rumor, jealousy, and the desperate need to believe that the devil was real. And as the gallows grew busy, as the air filled with the cries of the condemned, the people of Salem convinced themselves they were saving their souls. But in truth, they were losing them. By the summer of 1692, the fear that had begun with whispers had become a roar that consumed everything in its path. The trials had produced their verdicts, and the gallows on Gallows Hill stood ready. Between June and September, 19 people would be hanged, their deaths witnessed by the very community that had once called them friends and neighbors. Each execution was not only punishment but performance, a ritual meant to cleanse the village of its sin. The condemned were brought to the hill in carts, bound and silent. They were farmers, mothers, ministers, and servants. Some prayed aloud as the ropes were tied around their necks, their final words echoing across the fields. Others simply stared into the crowd, searching for familiar faces that now looked away. The townspeople watched in uneasy silence, believing that every death was a victory over evil. Yet deep down, they felt something else creeping in, a sense of guilt that could not be spoken. Among the victims was Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother whose reputation for kindness had once made her the heart of Salem village. When she was accused, even her friends hesitated to defend her. The court ignored her pleas of innocence, and she was hanged alongside others whose only crime was disbelief in the madness. Her death shocked many, but not enough to stop the machine that had already begun its work. Then came Giles Corey. At 81 years old, he refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. The court demanded a confession, but he gave them none. According to the law, a person who did not plead could not be tried, nor could their property be seized. For the judges, this defiance was intolerable. They ordered Corey to be pressed beneath heavy stones until he would speak. For 2 days he lay in the open field as weights were placed upon his chest, his ribs cracking under the pressure. When asked again to confess, his response was simple and unforgettable. More weight. These words, quiet and defiant, became a symbol of resistance against the tyranny that had gripped Salem. Giles Corey died without giving them what they wanted, and in doing so, he preserved the dignity that the trials had stripped from so many others. Each execution was meant to restore order, to prove that God was still watching over the colony. But instead they deepened the wound. The more they killed, the more paranoid the villagers became. If these people, once so pious and respectable, could be witches, then who was truly safe? The logic that had justified the hangings now turned inward, and fear began to feed on itself. Children who had once pointed fingers now trembled at night, terrified of what they had unleashed. Husbands accused wives, servants betrayed masters, and even ministers began to question their own faith. The sense of divine purpose that had once united Salem had splintered into a desperate scramble for survival. By the end of that summer, Salem was no longer a community but a battlefield of belief. The gallows had not rid the village of evil. They had only revealed the darkness that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. And as the bodies of the condemned swung in the breeze, the people of Salem prayed harder than ever, not out of devotion, but out of fear that they might be next. Beneath the cries of the afflicted and the sermons of the righteous, another story was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with spirits or spells. The Salem Witch Trials were not only a tale of fear but of power. When hysteria takes hold of a society, it does not rise from nowhere. It is guided, shaped, and often used. For generations, the people of Salem had lived under a strict and deeply patriarchal order. Men ruled the church, the courts, and the land. Women were expected to serve quietly within the home, to obey their husbands, and to uphold purity as their highest virtue. Yet within that rigid structure, some women had begun to step beyond their prescribed roles. Widows who owned property, midwives who possessed knowledge of healing, women who spoke too freely or questioned authority all became threats to the fragile hierarchy that kept order intact. When accusations began, it was no coincidence that many of the first victims were women who stood apart from the norm. Sarah Good was homeless and outspoken. Sarah Osborne had married a man beneath her social class. Bridget Bishop ran a tavern and wore bright clothing that offended the Puritan sense of modesty. Each of them defied the expectations placed upon them, and each was quickly branded as an agent of the devil. In a society where men held both religious and legal power, the trials offered a way to reinforce control. Every accusation was a reminder of who had the right to speak and who did not. Ministers preached that witches were servants of darkness, but in practice, the trials became a way to silence those who challenged the order of things. Women who confessed to witchcraft were often spared, while those who refused to yield to the pressure were condemned. In Salem, submission became the only path to survival. But gender was not the only weapon at play. Beneath the moral panic, greed and politics quietly fanned the flames. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property could be seized by the court or distributed to others. For a few, every new accusation was an opportunity. Families long feuding over land saw a chance to gain advantage. The estates of the condemned were absorbed into the hands of the powerful, their houses and fields taken under the guise of divine justice. Historians have traced the pattern, finding that many of those accused were tied to ongoing disputes with their accusers. Lines drawn on old maps became lines drawn in blood. In a small, struggling community where survival depended on land and influence, the witch trials became a convenient tool for settling scores. Even religion itself was not free from ambition. Some ministers used the hysteria to strengthen their grip on the fearful, preaching that only strict obedience could keep the devil away. The pulpit became a stage where faith and politics intertwined, and every sermon about sin deepened the people's dependence on authority. In the end, the devil that haunted Salem was not the horned creature of Scripture. It was something far more human. It was the hunger for control disguised as piety, the greed hidden beneath righteousness, the power that thrives when fear blinds reason. The witch hunt was never truly about witches. It was about who held the right to define truth, who benefited from belief, and who paid the price for questioning it. In that way, Salem was not an isolated tragedy but a reflection of something that has echoed throughout history. The faces may change, the accusations may evolve, but the pattern remains the same. Whenever power feels threatened, it finds a witch to burn. By the winter of 1693, the fever that had once consumed Salem began to break. The same voices that had once demanded justice now whispered in shame. The air that had been thick with accusation grew heavy with doubt. People began to look around and see what they had done. It happened gradually, then all at once. The panic that had felt righteous started to feel wrong. The judges who once ruled with divine certainty began to falter. Spectral evidence, once the cornerstone of every conviction, was questioned. How could a dream or a vision prove guilt when it existed only in the mind of the accuser? Even the ministers who had once stood behind the trials started to withdraw their support, realizing too late that faith had been twisted into fanaticism. The turning point came when the hysteria reached too close to power. Governor William Phips, who had authorized the special court, was forced to confront the nightmare he had unleashed when his own wife was accused of witchcraft. Suddenly, the madness was no longer something distant. It was in his home, among his own family. Within days, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, ending the machinery of persecution that had consumed the village for nearly a year. But ending the trials did not end the damage. The prisons were still full of people who had been accused, their lives shattered by months of fear and humiliation. Many could not pay the fees demanded for their release. Some returned to find their homes seized, their families scattered. Others were too broken to return to normal life at all. As the truth began to surface, a new kind of silence fell over Salem. The ministers spoke cautiously now, their sermons tinged with guilt. Ordinary citizens who had once pointed fingers now avoided eye contact in the streets. The same community that had once united in moral certainty was now bound together by shared shame. In the months that followed, spectral evidence was officially outlawed, and public confessions of error began to emerge. The governor issued pardons for the remaining prisoners. Yet there was no celebration, no relief. Only the quiet realization that faith, when unmoored from reason, could destroy the very soul it sought to save. By the time the last accused were freed, 20 lives had been taken. 19 by hanging, 1 by the slow crushing of stone. Dozens more carried invisible scars, reputations destroyed, families torn apart, futures lost. The hysteria had burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but ashes. When the gallows finally stood empty, Salem was not the same place it had been a year before. The fields still grew, the church bells still rang, but something in the spirit of the people had changed forever. The villagers awoke from their nightmare, but the memory of what they had done would never fade. The devil they had tried to cast out had not come from the forest or the sky. It had lived in their hearts, and for one terrible year, they had listened to its voice. When the hangings stopped and the prisons emptied, Salem was left in a silence that felt heavier than the gallows themselves. The fields that once echoed with sermons and cries now stood quiet. People spoke in hushed tones, afraid to mention the trials, afraid to remember, and even more afraid to forget. The same hands that had built the scaffold now tilled the earth again, pretending life had returned to normal. But nothing in Salem was normal anymore. For years, the town carried a wound that would not heal. The ministers who had once thundered from their pulpits now spoke of mercy instead of judgment. Some wept publicly, confessing their part in the tragedy. Judge Samuel Sewell stood before his congregation and admitted his guilt, asking God to forgive him for the innocent blood he had helped spill. In that moment, even the congregation could not look him in the eye. The same people who had once cried for vengeance now prayed for forgiveness. Others, like Reverend Samuel Parris, who had lit the spark of hysteria in his own home, struggled to maintain their authority. His sermons were met with cold stares and empty pews. Within a few years, he was forced to leave Salem, his reputation destroyed by the very panic he had helped unleash. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching, calling upon its citizens to repent for the sins of the witch trials. It was not a celebration, nor a ceremony of closure, but a day of quiet reckoning. People gathered in churches across the colony, bowing their heads as ministers spoke of human weakness and divine mercy. The message was clear. What had happened in Salem was not the work of the devil. It was the work of man. Slowly, the colony began to make amends. The families of the executed were granted small sums of money, symbolic gestures that could never replace what had been lost. In 1711, the government formally cleared the names of the condemned, acknowledging their innocence. Yet for those who had watched their loved ones die, justice came too late. The pain lingered in their homes, in their fields, and in their dreams. Salem became a place haunted not by witches, but by memory. The people who once believed they were chosen to protect holiness had instead exposed the darkness within their own hearts. They had learned, too late, that piety without compassion can become cruelty, and that fear, once unleashed, does not disappear when the hangings end. In time, the story of Salem would be retold in whispers, then in books, and finally as legend. But for those who lived it, it was never folklore. It was a mirror held up to their souls, a reflection of how faith can lose its light when blinded by fear. The witch trials ended in 1693, but their echoes never truly faded. In every confession and apology, in every act of silence and sorrow, Salem remained a reminder that the line between faith and fanaticism is not drawn in history books. It is drawn in the human heart. Centuries have passed since the last noose tightened on Gallows Hill, yet the echoes of Salem have never gone silent. The world today may look different, filled with light, science, and reason, but the same shadow that fell over that small Puritan village still lingers in the corners of our minds. Salem was not an isolated tragedy. It was a pattern, one that repeats whenever fear outweighs truth and emotion conquers logic. Every era has its own witch hunts. In the 20th century, they took the form of political purges, when suspicion became law and accusation replaced evidence. During the Red Scare, careers were destroyed not by proof, but by rumor. In the Cold War, the same logic that once condemned witches was used to condemn neighbors, colleagues, and friends. To be accused was to be guilty. To question was to be complicit. Today, the stage has changed again, but the script remains familiar. The courtroom has become the internet, and the mob no longer gathers on cobblestone streets, but behind screens. With a few words typed into the void, reputations are destroyed in seconds. Facts bend beneath emotion. Outrage becomes currency. In a world driven by clicks and conflict, hysteria spreads faster than ever before. Just like in Salem, modern witch hunts thrive on certainty. The belief that we, and only we, see the truth. The belief that the other side is dangerous, corrupt, or evil. In this mindset, there is no room for empathy or understanding, only division. The names change, the tools evolve, but the mechanism of fear remains the same. The invisible enemies of the 21st century are not demons or witches but ideas, identities, and ideologies. They are painted as threats to the order of society, as symbols of danger that must be silenced or erased. And just like the villagers of Salem, we tell ourselves that we are doing what is right, what is moral, what is necessary to protect our way of life. Yet each time this cycle begins, the same truth emerges. It is not the accused who are most dangerous, but the accusers who lose themselves in their certainty. When belief becomes absolute and compassion disappears, reason collapses, and humanity falters. The story of Salem is not a relic to be studied behind glass. It is a warning written into the human condition. It reminds us that hysteria never dies. It simply changes its form, adapting to the fears of its age. The Puritans saw the devil in the woods. We see it in those who disagree with us. What Salem teaches, above all, is that the real witchcraft is not found in spells or spirits, but in the way fear can enchant a crowd, turning justice into vengeance and faith into blindness. The moment we stop questioning, the moment we surrender curiosity for conviction, the witch hunt begins again. Salem's ghosts are not trapped in the past. They walk with us still, whispering a question we have yet to fully answer. When fear returns, when the crowd gathers and the flames rise once more, will we recognize the pattern? Or will we repeat it, just as they did, believing that this time, we are the righteous ones? As the dust settled and the records of the trials were written into history, one truth became impossible to ignore. There were never any witches in Salem. There was only fear, and the terrible things people will do when they believe they are righteous. The true horror of Salem was not magic or the devil's hand, but the human mind consumed by certainty. In every confession, every accusation, every prayer for deliverance, there was a single thread that connected them all: belief without doubt. The Puritans were not monsters. They were human beings, convinced that they were saving their souls. That conviction made them unstoppable. They killed not for greed or revenge, but for what they thought was good. And that is what makes their story so haunting. The image of Giles Corey pressed beneath the stones still hangs over history like a shadow. His last words, "more weight," were not just an act of defiance but a reflection of conscience. A man crushed beneath the literal weight of his community's madness, refusing to submit to their lies. He became a symbol of resistance against the collective hysteria that demanded obedience. His death marked the breaking point between faith and reason, between truth and blind conviction. The Salem Witch Trials were never about witches. They were about people. About how fear can disguise itself as virtue, and how faith, once corrupted by pride, can become a weapon sharper than any blade. The judges believed they were protecting purity. The accusers believed they were defending God's kingdom. But beneath it all, it was the same darkness that has always haunted humanity: the need to control what we do not understand. The evil that swept through Salem did not come from spells or sorcery. It came from within. It came from whispers and pride, from the human desire to belong, from the fear of standing alone against the crowd. The devil they sought in the woods was not real, but the darkness they found in their own hearts was. And that is the final revelation. The Salem Witch Trials were not a story of supernatural horror, but of moral blindness. The danger was never witchcraft. It was conviction without compassion, faith without humility, and power without mercy. The devil was never in the forest. He was in the courtroom, in the pulpit, in the crowd. He was in them all, wearing the face of fear. The story of the Salem Witch Trials is more than a haunting chapter of American history. It is a mirror held up to human nature, reflecting the same shadows that still follow us. The real danger was never witchcraft, nor curses whispered in the dark. It was fear itself, and what people are willing to do when fear becomes stronger than reason. When logic is silenced and emotion takes control, when the desire to belong outweighs the courage to question, the past begins to repeat itself. Salem becomes every place where truth is buried under panic, where justice bends to anger, and where crowds choose vengeance over understanding. For all its tragedy, Salem stands as a warning carved into history. A reminder that even the most devout, the most certain, and the most moral among us can fall to darkness when we stop asking why. The witch hunts may have ended 3 centuries ago, but their spirit endures wherever hysteria takes hold. Salem was not only a village. It was a lesson. And that lesson still whispers through time, asking a question that every generation must answer for itself. When fear rises again, will we recognize the witch hunt within?